Welcome to another episode of Adoption and Beyond. I'm Elise White, Social Service Program Manager at Adoptions from the Heart and the co-host of this podcast.
And I'm Nicole Fowler, Director of Social Services at Adoptions from the Heart and the other co-host of this podcast.
Today, we're so excited to welcome Angela Tucker, a prominent transracial adoptee, author, and advocate. She offers valuable insight into the complexities of transracial adoption as well as the adoptee experience.
Yes, Angela is certainly well known in the adoption community. We share a lot of her stories and her series at our courses and in our information meetings. And we've really been looking forward to this conversation for months now.
Yes, so please settle in and join us for a meaningful conversation about transracial adoption, exploring Angela Tucker's experiences, insights, and advocacy work. Together, we'll reflect on her journey and discuss how we can continue growing and learning as an agency.
Hello, welcome to the Adoption and Beyond podcast. We are so excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be with you.
As one of the most recognizable voices in adoption, your work has profoundly impacted the way we understand transracial adoption. You've not only shared your own story, but have also amplified the voices of adoptees, offering invaluable insights and education on the complexities of adoption. For listeners who might not be as familiar with your story, could you share a little bit about your journey as a transracial adoptee and a bit about how your story unfolded?
Yes. Hello, Nicole. Hi, Elise. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, I was born in Tennessee and immediately placed in foster care. And then after about a year in foster care, was adopted to Washington State, where my white adoptive parents had already adopted several other kids, all from foster care and with different disabilities and special needs. And a lot of my health prognosis was quite unknown early on, and the doctors actually diagnosed me with spastic quadriplegia and said I would never walk. And so it really narrowed the field of people interested in adopting me. And so that's why they found my family across the country. My parents had already adopted several folks, including siblings with cerebral palsy and fetal alcohol syndrome, and a host of other things. And so I moved across the country and grew up in a small, kind of a mid-sized town of Bellingham, Washington, which is like pretty close to the Canadian border in between Vancouver, Canada, and Seattle, Washington. Predominantly white city. A really beautiful city and very family centric and lovely in many ways, except for me not having any access to Black culture was a little tricky and something I talk about a lot now. So I grew up in a closed adoption and in my early 20s was able to find my birth family. So that reunion was captured on a film called Netflix, which is a documentary that my husband shot and filmed and edited. And it was really a surprise to have it become so widely available through Netflix and Hulu and all those things. And so that was about 10 years ago. And a year and a half ago, I published a book all on these same topics. So I'm sure we'll get into it, but that's kind of the snapshot.
It's now time for us to jump into our What's Buzzing segment. Myra, what do you have for us today?
Thank you, Elise. So today I wanted to share with you guys a little bit about the teen mom, Caitlin Baltira. Do you guys know about her story or who she is?
I know just a little bit. I think Nicole is a little more familiar.
I've watched since the beginning 15 years ago. I believe it was about the time that I started at Adoptions from the Heart. And so I followed the whole story.
Okay, so for those who don't know, I'll just keep it short. She is from the show Teen Moms, and so when she was a teenager, she got pregnant and she chose adoption for her pregnancy. So during her I think it's been 16 years since she placed her child for adoption. She has, when it started, it was an open adoption, but throughout the years, they have had moments where they have an open adoption. Sometimes it's a little bit more close. Right now, in 2025, she has a closed adoption and she has no contact with her child. So she has lost all of her contact with them, and it's a complex situation, but I just wanted to share a little bit about this article, a story where they interview her, and she talks about regrets on not having guidance when she signed the papers as a birth mother, her open adoption papers. So the title of this article is Teen Mom Caitlin Valtierra Regrets Not Having Guidance When She Signed Papers for Open Adoption. I just wanted to read a little bit from that story. There's more to the story, and as always, I'll leave the link to the full story so you guys can read it. But this is what she says about that specifically. So, what Baltiera wishes she would have known 16 years ago. She says, I was never told a single thing about what adopted children go through as they get older, she said. Since then, she learned that adoptees face a range of mental health challenges, from feeling abandoned to dealing with addiction and suicidal ideation. Her advice for birth parents who are contemplating an open adoption is to educate themselves about the adoptees. She recommended speaking with a lawyer and having legal representation throughout the adoption process. Have a support system that is going to ask questions and truthfully explain to you what you're signing, she said. As a teenager, Valtiera didn't have adults helping her through this and advising her about the ramifications of agreeing to an open adoption. Now, as a 32-year-old, she emphasized that she would never let her children sign any paperwork without her knowledge and consent. So, there's a lot of stuff that I wish I could have changed, but I try not to live in the what ifs because that doesn't do anything good for me, she said. So, I bring her as an example of just a situation where you start with an open adoption and end with a closed adoption. Her specifics and her story are completely different, but I just wanted to talk to you guys about just openness in general and having adoptive parents who agree to an open adoption, but in time that closes for one reason or the other. As social workers, what do you guys like? What are your feelings on that? What can you guys share? And also a little bit more on like when she talks about like having a loyal and representation throughout the process, like as social workers. I don't know, I just want to hear your feelings, what you think of that, and yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for sharing, Myra. Wow, it's openness and adoption throughout a child's life is such a um hypothetical to talk about when we don't know what's going to happen. And every single adoptee is going to have a different story, different feelings, different journeys throughout that as well. And so much of that comes from the spirit of open adoption and not necessarily exactly what the agreement looks like. I do, because I know a little bit more about this story, I do know that they went through an agency, that the open agreement that they signed for the future was openness for the first 5 years, and then there was nothing specified after the first 5 years, which I found to be incredibly unethical of that of the way that worked. We do not believe in that here at Adoptions from the Heart. We want to set this up as an expectation of a lifetime of openness, whether adoptive parents communication, is harder at some point. Birth parents communication is harder at some point, but to set that expectation up forever, not for the first 5 years of a child's life, because then we see the ramifications that of that, of closing an adoption after having openness in an adoption. She's right. Going in as a 16-year-old without family support, without the support of somebody to look over those papers, she has no idea. Most expecting parents considering adoption for their child have never been through that before. They don't know what to expect or what to look for. So my advice is definitely to have some emotional and physical support through what you are signing and what that all looks like, and imagining what the future is going to look like. But that's so hard for somebody who's never been through even parenting before too. So it's so complicated. But and I agree with the advice about, having legal representation to look over things. However, I think the counseling part and counseling or social work part of it, having somebody to really help facilitate through that process, but making sure that you're working with an agency that really is going to respect all members of the adoption triad and their rights too. It would be
something that comes out of that. And I know it's such a complicated story too, and social media was involved in all of these things that, nobody could have told that day 16 years ago. But it's a very sad part of it now. And so complicated. Elise, what have your thoughts been?
I just want to echo what you've said about this counseling piece and how important and vital that is when making an adoption plan, and making a decision that's lifelong. And especially for a situation like this where she was a teenager, to make sure that she got, and I don't know if she did or not because I don't know the whole backstory, but making sure that the importance of counseling was there for her, would be really, really vital. And I can say, at our agency and hopefully at most agencies, a birth parent and an adoptive parent have two separate social workers so that each part of that relationship has their own advocate. And that's so important. It's really hard for a social worker to be able to work with both sides for many reasons. You want to make sure that you have your own individual advocate, your own individual counselor for that. And like Nicole said, you can never know what openness is going to look like throughout that child's, entire life. Circumstances change and life happens. But I can agree that to have an open adoption agreement that has a time limit set on it sort of negates that spirit of openness and what the hope would be for, having a growing relationship. So yeah, that's a tough situation. I don't know a lot about it, but I feel, for those birth parents for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with you both, and I am glad that at Adoptions from the Heart things are done differently, and I hope that other agencies can do things in an ethical way and be able to give that experience. I mean, the having a representative just from the same agency for a birth parent and another one for the adoptive parent, I think that's super important. So you know that that person is there specifically for you if you don't have family or if you don't have someone else that can, be that support for you throughout that experience. But thank you guys so much, and we will get back to our conversation.
But Angela, you talk a little bit about your documentary, which is called Closure. And I believe you started that as a personal record. You started filming that for yourself, right? What kind of motivated you to take that leap to bring it to a larger audience?
Definitely, it was home video footage. That was the intent. I told my husband, who was not a filmmaker by trade at that time, I just said, please capture everything on camera because if this is like the first and the last moment I ever get to see my birth mother, I want it on camera. And then there are other things that many non-adoptees don't think about that are so crucial, but I knew I'd be flooded and overwhelmed in the moment when I met my birth mother and then ultimately my birth father as well. But I was like, I want to remember, like, what is she wearing? What does her house look like? What cars are in the front yard? Like, all of these details would tell me a lot about her if it was like the first and last moment. And so that's why we captured this footage. But at the same time, I was working at a private adoption agency with many families in the home study process who were open to adopting and weren't fully understanding of the importance of openness. And so I decided to start sharing some of my own story with my clients, saying, I have really wonderful adoptive parents. They are very loving, and I needed to know where I came from. Like, these things are not interchangeable or mutually exclusive. And my clients were saying things like that, like, we're going to be the best parents ever to this kid, so they won't need to know where they came from. So I started sharing, like, no, it's not how it works for us adoptees. And that was, I found it to be a really change-worthy conversation. Like, families were moved to meet somebody like myself. And so my husband was like, well, why don't we just turn it into something that you can share with them so you don't have to kind of describe. So I'm like, think that's a great idea. And then we happen to have friends who are musicians who were like, we'd love to make a soundtrack for this. And it became just like a fun project for my husband, myself, our friends, making a movie. And that was the impetus. And it was really out of the blue when the bigger outlets called, because we weren't planning for mass distribution or anything like that.
That's amazing. Well, we're so thankful that that happened because we use a lot of that in our own education with our own clients that we work with every day. Was there something that, a pivotal moment or something that really drove you at that time to want to search for your birth mother, your birth father, or was it just like a culmination of being an adult and feeling like you wanted to open up that part of your story?
It was that in the state of Tennessee, you could legally access your original birth certificate at age 21. And so that was it. I'd really always wanted to know who my birth parents were. And so I just waited until that. And then when I submitted the forms, there were more dead ends. And so I started really the advocacy journey for adoptee rights, because I felt like this is wild that we have falsified birth certificates that say that my adoptive parents gave birth to me and that I can't access my own. And so when I didn't get my original birth certificate after going through their process and paying their fees, I decided to just take matters into my own hands.
I was wondering if you could share with us, you have, we all have different intersecting identities, and you as an adoptee and a transracial adoptee, at what point did you begin to explore your racial identity as well, and what prompted that, and in addition to the openness in your adoption?
Race was always a component of my thought process growing up. I'm grateful that you know, in the film Closure, my mom says something like, "We didn't really consider race. We just looked at each individual as their own person." I don't think I really felt that way. Like, I don't think my parents lived a colorblind life. For example, we always had black ornaments on the Christmas tree, or my mom, pre-internet, worked really hard to get me a black Cabbage Patch doll. And actually, not just me, but my siblings too. Even my white siblings had dolls and different toys that didn't just match their race, but it was kind of all representations, including disabilities too. So that was always an aspect, and I did feel like I was able to talk about race and racism growing up in my home, and being one of the only black kids in the school was a big deal for me. And starting to learn about tokenism earlier on, I would share stories about how, like, I would be picked for a basketball team without even trying out just because I'm black. And that was open conversation in our home. As well as, I have one sibling who's from Laos. She's a Laotian refugee, and she fled a civil war. So there was a lot of like worldly conversations about displacement of individuals and families, and why it is such that many people of color end up with white families, and learning about the history of whiteness in America. And so that was always kind of part of our conversations. I remember having these placemats at dinner. We all had them, and there were different topics. Like, someone might get a globe of the whole world, someone else might get like all of our presidents, or it was always learning. My parents were really big on learning. And so but even with the conversations in our home and kind of the book knowledge about racism, about the history of America, it really wasn't until I went to college that I started to reckon with my own racial identity. And that was because I chose to go to a predominantly white school, because it really reflected what I was familiar and comfortable with. But in going to college, I no longer had my parents right with me, where people could just see, like, oh, she's adopted. Instead, I was just a Black person in a predominantly white space, and people were like, "Why would you choose to come here? I don't get it." And so that's when I started really kind of dissecting why is it that I'm so comfortable in white spaces, and what does it mean to have grown up this way? And um, I think that's true for many transracial adoptees, that that's when kind of that consciousness raising begins.
Advice do you think you have for other transracial adoptees that may be grappling with their own identity, or maybe in homes where racial identity isn't really spoken about? How might you connect them to resources or offer that kind of support for helping them on their journey of finding and learning more about their own racial identity?
Well, this is one of the big reasons why I founded the Adoptee Mentoring Society, which is not just for transracial adoptees, it's for same-race adoptees too. But for me, I was seeing this happening so often where Black and brown adoptees were so uh, isolated from even the ability to form relationships with people like themselves. And so I created this virtual mentoring program, and it's been really a beautiful thing. So I always try to point people there, of course, but then the other strategy is working with families prior to adopting and really I get really deep with prospective adopters about, why do you think you'd be a good fit for adopting a child of color if you aren't living in a community that reflects that? So not just allowing prospective adopters to say, of course, we would love any child that comes into our home, but instead to go a step further. And if you are living a homogenous life, if you've had predominantly white friends and neighbors, that you have a gap in what you're able to do. It's like if you have never played a piano in your life and all of a sudden you think you're going to be good at teaching others how to do that, like, it's not true. And so I ask families early on, you need to make some changes in your life in order for this to be a safe place for the adoptee, because it's not just about 3 meals a day. A safe place means a school where they are represented not just by the other students, but by teachers and administration. Otherwise, what we see now happening is there's a lot of adult adoptees who are becoming estranged from their adoptive parents, not because they aren't nice parents, but because they can't go there to these really important places. Some of the updated language that I write about in my book from Colorblind is color evasiveness. So basically, colorblind, we were kind of allowing people to say, like, oh, too bad I don't know anything about race. I don't see color. But color evasiveness is like, in order to say you don't see color, you have to notice the difference. So you're actually taking an action to avoid. And with that, it's proven to have kind of stronger impact for folks, which is really, I think, crucial.
Absolutely. You talk about avoidance of a lot of these issues. And I think that kind of ties into this narrative of gratitude, which you talk a lot about in your new book, You Should Be Grateful, right? Working to change that gratitude narrative that I think is often thrust upon adoptees. I'd love
Yeah.
to know, how do you think that expectation of gratitude really affects adoptees' ability to process their own identity and their own experiences with their adoption?
It's really stunting,
Mm.
and we see this in mentoring of adoptees, that there's a lot of adoptees who are people pleasers, who are just really, they're almost chameleons, and like just great, the word grateful for anything that comes their way. Kind of a sense of buying into that story that I must have gotten a better life, which I don't agree with, and therefore I must fulfill that. And in my book, I actually write about this teenage mentee who astounded me with the language of being a good return on investment for their parents, is how they talked about this. That level of pressure is immense. On the flip side, I I think I struggle with a little people, maybe not people pleasing, but the overachieving piece. I, you know, always trying to do more, do more, do more, and partly because I love to work, but I do think a little piece of it is like I heard growing up that I needed to break the cycle. And that language, I think, has propelled me into feeling like I must contribute in a big way to society. I'm, aware of it. And that's one piece that I think many adoptees don't have that awareness of where that insatiable drive might be coming from. And that's problematic because then it leads to burnout and honestly self-harm and suicide. I mean, I think about October 30th is Adoptee Remembrance Day because we lose so many adoptees, and these adoptees who are completing suicide, most of them, many of them who I know who have done that, sadly, had really loving parents, but they didn't have the conversations about, not needing to fulfill a role in order to make their parents feel like they did a good thing. Um, so that those are some of the ways it shows up.
You have made a huge impact, and I hope that you haven't put too much pressure on yourself because you have educated so many people. But it sounds like that is definitely something that occurs more with adoptees. And we've tried to harness openness as, this was a plan that multiple sets of people made for you, and we have this open adoption to hopefully foster a child's identity, but we can't always do that. And what do you suggest for adoptive parents to initiate meaningful conversations with their children who are adopted or adopted transracially to make this better?
Yes, I love this question, and I'm writing a children's book around this right now, actually. And I've built a model called the Inclusive Family Support Model, which differentiates contact from openness. So we previously have really put those two things together to say if you have an open adoption, it's because you're meeting with your birth parents and you have this open line of communication. We know that that's not always possible. Maybe birth parents are deceased, they're unknown, they're truly unsafe, which is another concept that needs a lot of dissection about is it a true safety issue or a perceived safety risk? But anyways, there's lots of reasons why contact with birth family and adoptee might not be possible. So I love educating adoptive parents around what I feel like I got. Technically I had a closed adoption, but in my model, I actually had what I call a spirit of openness. And that means that in the home, there was a lot of freedom to wonder aloud about who my birth parents were. And I coach parents to try to do this themselves, that if you notice that your child is loves art, then you could say, I wonder if someone in your birth family loved art. I wonder if your birth mom was a painter. Like just wondering. It doesn't have to be true because what openness in that way, the spirit of openness does when adoptive parents are talking about adoption with ease in the home, it actually strengthens the relationship between an adoptee and their parents. And that's what the research has shown us. And I loved that growing up too, just hearing that. I played basketball, I played all these sports, and so it was really natural for all of us to wonder where that came from, but to name it and to have fun playing around with it. And that is one of the biggest recommendations I have because it helps also deviate from what often happens, which is when we don't have contact, the only time adoption is discussed is when there's negative behaviors that adoptive parents, if a child is struggling with anger or outbursts, that sometimes adoptive parents attribute that to birth parents or time in utero. Um, and and that's not great. Something I loved that was modeled for me was my brother Kyle has fetal alcohol syndrome. And so my mom would also always say, yeah, we know that Kyle's birth mother was intoxicated when she gave birth to him, and she struggled with that, obviously, but that's not all she was. We will never meet her. She passed away early, but we know that everybody has other traits. Maybe they're humorous, they have sarcasm, there's so many other ways you can go instead of just focusing on that negative or that reason for the adoption. Humanizing birth parents is something that is so important to me, and I don't let any parent off the hook, even if you don't know the child's birth parents.
I love that you talk about the spirit of open adoption because we talk a lot about that. There's a difference between saying we'll consent to 2 visits a year and we're really excited to have 2 visits a year,
Right.
right?
Yes. The transactional versus a vibe of like, yes, you're part of us. Yeah.
And your children are growing up hearing the language that you use, of course, and part of the spirit of open adoption, I think, like you're talking about, is how we speak about birth parents when they're not around to our children,
Yes.
which is just so important for everything, right? Our kids are always listening, we know that. But based off of your own experiences, and we as adoption social workers, we're always trying to do better as well. What would you like to see in sort of the current adoption practices to better really support our adoptees?
One of the biggest things I think is listening to adoptees. This sounds simple, but what I have seen is that my work isn't necessarily unique. There are lots of other adoptees who have said similar things before me, currently, yet they aren't listened to in the same way that I am. And I think it's because people are able to see through my film that I have a positive relationship with my adoptive parents. Adoptees who articulate anger with or frustration at the industry without pairing it with, and I love my adoptive parents, are really immediately discarded, and that is problematic. So that's one thing I would love to see change is how can we listen to adoptees without pretty much what it ends up being is like the audience or the listener has to have their needs taken care of. And since the societal view of adoption is that it's just a beautiful thing, what it looks like for other people to have their needs taken care of is knowing that the adoptee is grateful for all the things that their adoptive parents gave them. They're happy with their life. You know, that has got to change.
And I think that goes for a lot of things, right? Like it goes for everything. Nobody listens enough these days and holds space for the loss that comes with adoption, because adoption can be at its greatest, most beautiful form. It will still always come with loss, no matter what kind of relationship you have with your birth family. Even if that's beautiful, even if you see them several times a year, there's still loss there.
So lost. Yeah, one of the things that I say in keynotes or in workshops is that I love my adoptive parents and I wish I was never adopted. And I'm hopeful that that helps people understand these two things are not intertwined, actually.
Absolutely. And it's got to be, a host of like multiple different emotions to hear that. And people are going to, no matter how you come to parenting, children are going to have different feelings than you. And they're allowed to express those emotions. And I
Yeah.
just appreciate you saying that. And so much of this, I think, is adoptive parents resolving some insecurities about that and what parenting is in general.
Yes.
But then we have that extra layer of parenting through adoption or parenting through transracial adoption, which just adds so much more to the child. I want to talk about you've consulted because you're talking about the way the society sees adoption as well. And you've consulted on major media products like NBC's This Is Us, helping to shape how adoption is portrayed on screen. From your perspective, what are some of the most common misconceptions or gaps in media portrayals of adoption? I know you've spoken a little bit on it, but anything else too? I'm sure we could talk about this forever as well. What evolution do you hope to see in the future in media and society?
It was so fun, such an honor to be able to work on that show and a few others. Something that I've found in the writing rooms when there's not an adoptee present is this tendency to always allow the adoptive parent to speak on behalf of the adoptee, even if the adoptee is a full-fledged adult, and many times still using the word adopted child, even when the adoptee is a full-fledged adult. And so that's something that I've worked hard to help instill is the adoptee has a perspective and let's listen to it. But adoption still societally in media, the portrayal is one of infantilization, that we are just little babies that need saving is really the dominant thought. The the realization that we grow up, you know, teenagers, young adults, we're still adoptees when we're 50 years old, 70 years old. That's new. So it's something I'm excited to explore, and I'm hopeful um, that we can write some new episodes for different shows around this. But something that's really big for adoptees is when adoptees choose to get pregnant and give birth. And Nikki Chung, she's an author who wrote a couple books called All You Can Ever Know and some others, but one of her books, she writes about this time period when she gave birth as just being monumental in in terms of her adoptee identity, because for so many adoptees, that's the first time you see someone that looks like you. And then you're also revisiting that time when perhaps you were relinquished. And so it's just a confluence of things that makes for a really dynamic time period that I think could be explored in really amazing ways. So yeah, just the adoptee-centric viewpoint is certainly missing, and I've had fun trying to put that more in the forefront. The next one that's a real close second is portrayal of birth parents, which still tends to be, you know, like the losing Isaiah birth mom, a poor black woman who's homeless and on drugs. And so for even This Is Us, I was working with them to make sure that Randall's birth mother was not that. And she wasn't. She's a woman who has a job and she's doing life just like many birth parents are. So that was felt kind of groundbreaking for me as well.
I love this conversation. I think it's so interesting. And I have watched This Is Us, which is, I mean, I think everybody loves that show if you've seen it. And I think one of the things that the adoptive parents struggled with, the theme on that show was talking about race, in their home, not just with Randall, but with their other children and
Yeah.
as a family. And so how would you recommend sort of approaching conversations about race with adoptive parents who may not fully grasp the complexities that come along with that for their children?
I'm having this conversation so often. Sometimes you just have to put the primarily white parents in a position that they aren't used to. Reading Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible White Knapsack is really important. And so helping them see what does the world look like through our eyes? Like if we only know whiteness as the norm, as the status quo, then inevitably we're going to measure ourselves up that way, which is impossible because the standards aren't the same across the board. So the conversations for me really, I think I alluded to this earlier, but started with if you don't have diversity in your life right now, racial diversity, then that's sending a message, that's not important to you. I mean, it's hard for people to hear that, but if you live in a predominantly white space and you enjoy it and want to stay in that space, then that is evidence, that diversity must not be a value. It's really hard to say this out loud because living in it's a big deal to like ask someone to move into different neighborhoods, but I feel irked even when I speak with folks who are like, I think I'm going to adopt a white kid, so I'm not going to even, we don't need to talk about the race stuff. And I'm like, why? So still, like, you choosing to raise a white child in full homogeneity still really impacts others like transracial adoptees like myself or like our whole country. And I don't quite understand how that's valuable, So it's really like excavating people's comfort and discomfort. And so if you're not willing to go there, then absolutely we can't expect that they'd be available to a child who wants to talk about code switching and why it is they want to like wear their hoodie and not show their natural hair at school. It's just like real conversations people have. If a parent isn't able to think about it from their own perspective, then how are you going to understand that what your child is doing is actually trying to like minimize themselves and there's no joy or pride in their race? It's really hard to feel proud and powerful as a black or brown person if we don't see and like can touch and feel others who we see that way. We just don't have enough representation in other ways that we're gonna be able to infuse that into ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up such a good point about regardless of the racial background of the child you want to adopt, these are important conversations for everybody in
Everybody,
today's climate, especially, right? Like these are conversations that we all need to be having. And for people that are really interested in learning more, like want to learn more and do better, what kind of resources might you suggest for them?
I have this workshop that I offer called Cultivating an Anti-Racist Family Network. And essentially, I've taught all these workshops on anti-racism to agencies like yours, but the people who come are typically only the parents. And I'm like, there's the aunt, the uncle, the siblings, the teachers, the neighbors, the doctors. All these people in our kids' lives are need to be speaking the same language. And I realized this really in thinking about my own life. My parents, like I said, we had a pretty open home to talk about race, adoption. But like if I would go over to my grandma's house, all of that was like all of a sudden stunted. And I think that moving between those spaces, I really want to eliminate. And so I created this virtual workshop where a family can invite their whole community, their network, the people in their child's lives. And now let's get on Zoom and talk about all of these things. Let's talk about the aspects where people aren't sure how to ask questions, and it's been really incredible. It's fostered what I wanted, which is a safer environment for the adoptee, not just in their immediate home. So shameless plug, but I would love for folks they could think about that. There's lots of other resources which are really adoptees centric, adoptees speaking out. And I think those are also great resources.
Perfect. I took notes on that, the name of your workshop. So thank you for sharing that. Um, and sometimes it can feel, so as a social worker approving a family for adoption, one, and then transracial adoption, two, it can feel like, where is that? Where is their community? Okay, is that this? Am I putting, a family is safe for a child physically? That's what the state says has to be there. That's the bare minimum, though. We here
Right.
at Adoptions from the Heart at least want to make sure families are prepared for all of these things that come along with it, but that can feel intimidating as a social worker as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for like what is the bare minimum community makeup?
Yeah.
What is that?
I do think that social workers have often stopped at asking questions that only get at a, a prospective family's heart and wishes. And so I've taken steps to make things more concrete. And it can feel kind of awkward, but I am asking now, if we have a concentric circle, like the closest circle, the smallest circle, this is your immediate family. Who is in your immediate family? Talk to me about those people with regards to their race and their adoption status. So in the first circle, this is your like the parents or grandparents, um, siblings, like the people who are going to be in and out of your home on a really off common basis. Tell me just only, are they a person of color and are they an adoptee? Yes or no? And then you go out a ring, and this is now your neighbors. Same question. Like person of color, adoptee, yes or no? And then we go out a ring and we're talking more about the grocery stores that you go to, the playgrounds that you visit, and the schools, your doctor's office. Same question. That's it. Yes or no? And I have people write this down instead of being able to say we really value diversity and we're going to go to the event that the local university hosts on, Martin Luther King Day. We're so excited about that. We go to Mexican restaurants, we love Mexican food. It's like those check boxes don't work anymore. So the day-to-day life, when you're in that bigger circle of grocery stores, is the child see people of color. And this activity forces the parents to become more aware of that and then put it on paper. And maybe that's a place where they see that their values don't really match up with the reality. So those conversations I'm having, and it goes out even further. I have little diagrams for this. But ultimately getting to your county and look up your demographics. And but all of that data only matters if the prospective family has already bought into this truism that cultural neglect is a safety issue.
I love that you talk about these diagrams because I think people need to sometimes take pen to paper and see this. It's kind of, like when we talk about the privilege for sale exercise and watching people take their steps forward or take their steps backward and where they end in the room at the end of the day.
Yes.
For our adoptive families always say, wow, really seeing that hit home
It's
for me instead of just talking about it.
Is there anything that's come up here that you want to see happen in the future of adoption? Any advice for anybody? Any thoughts that you'd like to share?
I mean, I'm kind of curious from you because I want to speak directly to your audience if there are specific angles to that question.
Yes, my personal angle is trying to help social workers understand that these conversations are extremely important to have with prospective adoptive parents. And I applaud prospective adoptive parents who, after going through education and courses and things, say it's not right for a child
Yeah.
to. And so I make sure to say that having the child at the forefront, of your mind makes me trust in your family. And then we write our home study a certain way so that it's not open to transracial adoption because
Yeah.
they're trying to protect.
Yeah.
And I applaud that. But sometimes I think it's hard for especially new social workers coming out, having these conversations. And that's kind of who I wanted to speak to in those moments. It can be really just difficult.
Oh man, my heart just is so happy when prospective adopters are able to be honest and they say I've learned so much, I've listened, and yeah, we aren't equipped, in the same way that we would absolutely love a child who maybe needs a wheelchair, but we live in a townhome that has 5 stories and we can't possibly make that accessible for them. So we don't think we should be an option for a child with a disability. Like, I think that same conversation needs to be as easy with race, and I've had some of these conversations where they say we would love to love on a black or brown child and absolutely would love them, but learning what we've learned, we don't think we'd be the best parent fit for them. I like my heart just explodes with joy because we need to stop this we have too many generations right now. I see this through my mentorship because I mentor 12 and up, and I'm mentoring 60, 70, and 80-year-old adoptees who there's too many generations of the same story, the same pattern. My parents love me, but they just couldn't talk about race. My parents love me, but they just demonized my birth parents like crazy. Now, so much of the estrangement is happening. My parents tried to give me the best life they could, but I cannot have them in my life because XYZ. Like, in order to stop that, it starts with these families being honest. And with social workers, we can, I think many social workers do a great job of articulating this is not a judgment against you, but instead of kind of stopping at please think about what's best for the child, I think social workers can go another step by saying we have enough evidence now, we have enough data, we have enough adoptees who've been speaking out, and you can hear them here, 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 and here. Look at adoptee TikTok, look at hashtag adoptee voices on Instagram, and you can see there's a lot of frustration. There's 1 in 4 adoptees who seek therapy are thinking about suicide. And for these families to know your child would be no different. I know you like to think like we would do it different. Like, unless you're doing those things we talk about, moving to another area, making new friends, changing up that demographic, it's not going to be any different.
It's so important to have these uncomfortable conversations, and I think something that you do is help make those conversations a little more comfortable for
Yay! Yes, because I feel like I really don't like using the term uncomfortable conversations because, again, it's like putting a judgment on something. We're just words, and for me, I'm not uncomfortable. So for people to like put a label on a conversation, do that if it applies to you. Like, I'm uncomfortable with this conversation. Okay. But the conversation in and of itself isn't necessarily uncomfortable. I love it.
and we like to have these conversations too. I think it's hard for our clients a lot, and I think that's
Completely.
something we see daily. And that's a challenge that
Yeah.
we navigate for sure, and a challenge for our clients to navigate as well. But you create safe spaces for people,
All
and
right.
appreciate that
I mean,
greatly.
it's hard for clients, and you can dig into why is that. And one of the questions I ask in my workshops is like, why do you think transracial adoption is so often synonymous with white parents and black and brown kids? And in order to answer that question, you have to start thinking about privilege.
Mhm.
And I know people don't really like to do that. And you also have to start thinking about like, okay, wait, maybe my kid's birth parents like actually really would have loved to parent their child, but they can't because they've been systematically oppressed. That's the only reason they can't keep their kid. They're homeless because of these things and oh, the laws that didn't allow like black families to stay together. So that sure, it is not comfortable for many white people to like excavate history and how that has led to gains, including being able to build a family at the expense of someone else. Yeah, that's hard stuff. But you can't adopt if you can't come to have that conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you for your insight and being willing to educate people on that, because it's important. And I want to be super mindful of your time. And so just as a general overview, if there's anything else that you want people to take away today from our discussion, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, this has been so great. I'm always doing some educational type thing on Instagram. My handle is at Angie Adoptee. And then my website, angelatucker.com, has all my resources, which many of them I try to make free for everybody to use. some of my other films, and writing, as the resources that you talked about. So I hope folks, stumble on over. That'd be great.
You mentioned a children's book as well.
Yeah, it doesn't have a publisher yet, but yes, I'm working on one around the concept of the ghost kingdom. So I write about this concept, but essentially it's around the openness aspect. So if you don't know who your kid's birth parents are, this is going to be written for 4 to 7 year olds, that the parents can read this book with the child and basically wonder aloud. It's like I'm trying to help adoptive parents get comfortable with that wondering aloud aspect. So that's the book.
I love that. And I know adoptive parents will appreciate that so much because when kids are in imaginative thinking, how do we help them through
Yeah.
wondering? So that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Can't wait to buy that from you and share that with our families. And we appreciate
Thank you.
so much.
So now I would like to move on to our Ask Anything segment. This question that I have today comes from Michael. Michael is an adoptive parent. So Michael says, my wife and I adopted our daughter 3 years ago. We went into adoption wanting an open adoption and for our child to have contact with her birth family. Unfortunately, her birth mother stopped contact with us after 2 years. We, of course, want to give her, the birth mom, space, but we don't want our daughter to lose contact with her roots. In what ways can we continue to have that openness with our child without having her birth parents in the picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a fear of a lot of adoptive parents, especially adoptive parents that are really hoping for that openness. This is something we see pretty frequently, where birth parents, things in their lives change and openness changes with it. And that can sort of ebb and flow throughout a child's whole life, what that openness really looks like. I would say there's importance in continuing to talk about their story. There's importance in sharing things like a life book, with your child and remembering, all of the times that they had visits with their birth parents and showing them, hopefully, if you have photos from that and talking about that, and keeping their birth parents, spirit alive in your home, even if you're not physically seeing them or you don't have direct contact with them at that point, so that your child always has this sentiment and this feeling that their birth parents are important because they are, and that you love them and you're thinking of them, even if you're not in that direct contact or you're not currently having visits with them. That would be probably my, piece of advice. Nicole, what about you?
I think that all sounded excellent. And definitely how I would advise this family too. If you get the opportunity, for anybody who hasn't started the open adoption process yet or been chosen or placed, if you get the opportunity to have a pre-placement meeting or to meet at the hospital or meet at placement time or meet afterwards, I know there's going to be so much on your minds of fears and optimism and hopes and all of so much on your mind and legal issues and all sorts of things. But to stop and take a moment to think, what if we don't get to speak to this birth parent again? What if they're grieving, or what if circumstances in their lives have changed and we don't have that openness that we really want? What what do I want out of this moment now? And being able to respectfully, of course, and only if the birth parents are expectant or birth parents are okay with it, but taking pictures and asking questions about them and their personalities and their lives and their hopes and dreams and what they would want this child to know, just in case.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for your answer, and we will go back to our conversation.
What an incredible discussion with Angela Tucker that we had. We covered so much in our short time together, and just so appreciative of her being here with us. Elise, do you have a parting thought from this episode?
Yeah, Nicole, we did. We talked about so much, and so much of it was really important. And it's hard to just kind of pull one or two things. But I would say, just remembering the importance of community and creating a community for yourselves as adoptive parents, but also for your child, especially if there's a transracial adoption and your community doesn't match the background of your child. That means it's time to expand your community, right? And finding ways to connect your child to their culture, and finding ways to bring their culture into your home too, which should be their, safe space. And just creating outlets for your child to hopefully be able to talk to you. And even when they're having a hard day, knowing they can come to you and ask questions or seek guidance and know that you're going to help them find the answers to their questions or help them connect to their culture if that's what they want to do. And being really open for that for your child. Nicole, what about you? Do you have a certain parting thought?
I agree completely. And with the questions, and um, I've thought about like in the future, my children, I want them to trust that they can come to me with anything. And even if my heart's broken or I'm feeling insecure, I'm sad, or anything about that or angry, anything that they come to me with, that they're in a safe space and protected, and I'm there for them. So being able to prepare for those conversations with children through adoption, because if we see anything, it's that every adoptee is going to have a different experience and have different feelings, and different personalities and different things that they need or don't need. So I think it just Angela sharing with us so openly her story and her feelings, um, and also relating that to community and other adoptees. So just all together on a micro scale of our own family, and then a macro scale of community and world, and being able to make sure that we have that preparation from the beginning and before, and it's not a depending on what happens in my adoption, we're going to expand our community. That's not the way it works, I don't believe. So
Absolutely.
it's been great. And I'm very much looking forward. I know I said it so many times, but to the children's book too. I think that is going to be so helpful for not only adoptees, but every child, that through any circumstances, to welcome these intersecting identities and having an understanding of other children's circumstances and families.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
That wraps up this episode of Adoption and Beyond. We hope you found our discussion today insightful.
As we celebrate Adoption from the Heart's 40th anniversary all year long, if you are a part of our AFTH family, we welcome you to share your own personal stories about AFTH over the years.
We also welcome comments and messages on our social media, or you can email us at adoption@afth.org.
And be sure to subscribe to Adoption and Beyond so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. If you enjoyed today's discussion, we'd love if you could leave a review or share this episode with a friend.
Just a special thanks to Angela Tucker, and thank you for all of our listeners for tuning in. We look forward to connecting with you again in our next episode.